The vibration was constant now, low-frequency trembling that lived in the teeth and the inner ear, ceasing only when the heavier impacts replaced it with a violence that made the air itself feel solid. In the cellar of the tenement block on Schanhauser Allee, which had been repurposed as the command post for Sector Z, the dust never settled. It hung in a permanent, choking fog, illuminated by the guttering light of 2 kerosene lanterns and the occasional erratic flash of a naked bulb powered by a dying generator. Oberleutnant Stefan Kallis sat at a school desk that had been dragged down from the ruins above. The wood was scarred with initials carved by children who were likely dead or fleeing west, but Kallis traced the grooves with a grime-stained thumb, a small, tactile anchor to a reality that no longer existed. He was 32, but in the dim, yellow light, with his hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to have retreated deep into his skull, he looked 50. His uniform was gray, coated in the ubiquitous brick dust that turned every man in Berlin into a statue before he was even a corpse. "Map update," Kallis croaked. His voice was ruined, stripped raw by the dust and days of shouting over the roar of artillery. Feldwebel Braun, a man who had survived the retreat from Kursk and now moved with the disjointed and jerky efficiency of a marionette with tangled strings, stepped forward. He didn't salute. Protocol had died somewhere between the Oder River and the city limits. He simply placed a finger on the map, spread across the desk. The paper was worn soft as cloth, stained with coffee and darker rust-colored spots. Runners. From the north reports Soviet armor at the S-Bahn ring, Braun said, his tone devoid of inflection. Here and here. They've breached the perimeter at Pankow. We have reports of T-34s moving down the Berliner Straße. Kallis stared at the red grease pencil lines. They looked like arterial bleeds, spreading uncontrollably toward the center of the paper where the Reichstag and the Chancellery sat. And our support, the Nordland Division. Fragmented, Braun said. We have small groups holding cellars. No cohesion. No radio contact since 0400. Kallis nodded slowly. This was the routine. The slow, grinding amputation of the city. He picked up his cup of ersatz coffee, a bitter sludge made from acorns and roasted grain, and took a sip. It was cold. Everything down here was cold. A damp, penetrating chill that emanated from the sweating brick walls, smelling of mold, unwashed bodies, and the copper scent of fear. Outside, or rather, above, the Stalin organs, the Katyusha rockets began to wail. It was a terrifying sound, a screeching tear in the sky followed by a series of overlapping crashes that sounded like a giant kicking down a door. The cellar ceiling rained plaster. A fine white powder coated the map, obscuring the red lines of the enemy advance. Kallis brushed it away. He didn't flinch. Flinching took energy, and he had none left to hoard. He looked around the room. It was filled with the refuse of a collapsing army. A heap of Panzerfausts leaned against the wall like discarded umbrellas. A radio operator, a boy no older than 16, with an oversized helmet sliding over his eyes, was hunched over a field transceiver, desperately twisting dials, trying to fish a voice out of the static. In the corner, 3 members of the Volkssturm men in civilian coats with yellow armbands sat on ammunition crates, sharing a single crumpled cigarette. They looked like ghosts waiting for permission to fade away. This was the machine of survival. It was broken, rusting, and running on fumes, but it still turned. Kallis had orders to hold Sector Z. He had orders to mobilize every male between 15 and 60. He had orders to execute defeatists. He had done none of these things in the last 6 hours because the logic of the orders had evaporated. There was no sector to hold. There were only ruins and the spaces between them. Any word from the flak tower? Kallis asked. The Zoo flak tower was their anchor, a massive concrete fortress that was supposedly impregnable. housing thousands of civilians and the heavy 12.8 centimeters guns that were now being depressed to fire at ground targets. Nothing, the boy at the radio said, his voice cracking. Just static, Herr Oberleutnant, and music. The Russians are broadcasting waltzes on our frequencies. Callas rubbed his face. Waltzes? How civilized. He stood up, his knees popping, and walked to the heavy iron door that led to the street. He needed to see. The map was a lie. It was a two-dimensional abstraction of a three-dimensional hell. He needed to see the sky to know if it was day or night, for down here, time had dissolved into a single, gray loop of bombardment. He pushed the door open and stepped into the stairwell. The air grew hotter as he ascended, smelling of burning. Rubber and sulfur. He reached the ground floor, or what remained of it. Leaving the apartments exposed like a dollhouse, out onto the street, it was unrecognizable. The familiar geometry of Berlin, the wide avenues, the orderly facades had been chewed up and spat out. The street was a canyon of rubble, mountains of brick and twisted rebar blocking the tram lines. A burning Panther tank sat in the middle of the intersection, its turret blown off, black oily smoke corkscrewing into the sky. It was late afternoon, Callas guessed, but the sun was a pale, sickly disk behind the smoke. Shedding no warmth, a group of refugees shuffled past the burning tank, heads down, pulling carts piled with bedding and clocks and useless heirlooms. They moved with the silent, trance-like shuffle of the damned. They didn't look at Callas. They didn't look at the tank. They just looked at their feet, stepping over the corpses that had been pushed to the gutter like drift ice. Callas watched. A woman in a fur coat dragging a sled loaded with books. Books. He wanted to laugh, but his throat was too dry. What was she going to do with books? Build a fort. Eat the pages. Oberleutnant. The shout came from the cellar stairs. It was Brown. There was an urgency in his voice that cut through. Callas's numbness. Callas turned and descended back into the gloom. Brown was standing by the radio operator, holding a piece of paper that shook in his hand. The boy looked pale, his eyes wide and terrified. "What is it?" Callas asked, stepping back into the circle of lantern light. "Did the tower fall?" "No." "Sir," Brown said. He held out the paper. A message. From the Chancellery, Priority 1, direct from the Vorbunker. Callas took the paper. It was a standard Wehrmacht message form, the paper thin and yellow. The pencil scrawl was hurried but legible. To CMD Sector Z, Oberleutnant Callas, from OKH, Citadel Time, 1645 Immediate Deployment Order. Army, Group Steiner has launched counteroffensive. From north, 4 SS Panzer Corps advancing to relieve city. You are ordered to hold current. Line at all costs. Link up imminent. Victory depends on your tenacity. Hold for Steiner. Callas read it twice. He read the time stamp. He read the call sign. It was authentic. It had the correct encryption codes for the day. Steiner, Callas whispered. The name hung in the air like a prayer. "They're coming," the radio boy said, a desperate hope lighting up his face. Steiner is coming. He's going to break the encirclement. The old men in the corner looked up. One of them straightened his armband. For a second, the energy in the room shifted. The exhaustion seemed to lift. A counteroffensive. An army corps, panzers, fresh troops. It was the miracle they had been promised for weeks. The wonder weapons hadn't appeared, but the armies were real. Callas looked at the map again. He looked at the red grease lines he had drawn himself. Based on the reports of dying men who had seen the Soviet tanks with their own eyes, Steiner is attacking from the north, Brown said, tracing a line on the map. If he pushes through Oranienburg, he could cut off the Soviet spearhead at Pankow. That's right in front of us. We just have to hold. Callas felt a surge of adrenaline. Ah. Chemical spike that made his hands tremble. He looked at the paper. Hold for Steiner. It was a lifeline. It was a reason to keep fighting. It was a reason to send those old men out into the rubble with their single-shot Panzerfausts. It was a reason to tell the boy at the radio that he wouldn't die in this cellar. But then the disturbance settled in. It wasn't a sound. It was a memory. A precise, factual, jagged edge of memory that Callus couldn't smooth over 2 days ago. Before the phones went dead, he had spoken to a logistics officer, a friend from the academy, who was stationed in the rear near Eberswald. The man had been drunk, weeping over the line. He had told Callus about the disintegration of the Northern Front. He had told him about the units melting away, the officers stripping their uniforms and fleeing west. "Who is in Army Group Steiner?" Callus asked, his voice quiet. Brown blinked. "Sir, it's the 11th SS Panzer Army, the 3 SS Panzer Corps," Callus said. He looked at the message, the paper fluttering slightly in the draft from the stairs. "I saw the roster summaries last week. The 3rd SS Panzer Corps has no tanks, Brown. They have 12 functioning vehicles. 12. Maybe they were reinforced," Brown argued, but the hope in his voice was brittle. "Maybe reserves were brought up from the south.